guys, it's Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zicree of Space Command. And today I'm wearing my Alexandria Ocasio Green New Deal shirt, which was drawn by my friend Arlen Schumer, who did my favorite cover of the Twilight Zone Companion, the second revised edition. We're now up to the third revised edition, so go out and get it. It's very different from the previous editions. It's on Amazon, buy it. And we're rocketing along with Ashes, Elaine's film, and Space Command, and the Showrunners Network, and Sweet Haven, and Greenlighting Yourself, any number of projects. There's lots to talk about in the days to come. But finally, today, I'm starting on my history of science fiction films of the 90s. And we'll see how far we get. Maybe we'll get to 1995 if we're lucky. But as you know, I've been doing a history of science fiction. Well, the genesis of this was I was on James Cameron's science fiction history show, and talking Twilight Zone, and I just felt that that was leaving a lot of things out that we should get into. So I started by doing a history of science fiction literature, novels. Then I moved into science fiction movies. Then we'll do TV shows. Then we'll do comic books, graphic novels, etc. So, but I've said previously in my most recent videos on this subject that I personally feel that the 1970s to the 1990s was the golden age of science fiction film. And the reason for this is it was an incredible number of great films that combined computer effects, practical effects, miniatures, that sort of thing, with a wonderful talent base, wonderful writing, wonderful direction. And then in more recent years, it's become a little less spectacular because you've spun off a lot of sequel after sequel after sequel to, I think, diminishing returns, and superhero movies have taken sort of center stage in many ways, and studios are playing it very, very safe. And basically everything got started. There were science fiction films from the beginning of film, essentially, with Méliès, and then H.G. Wells, George Pal, etc., etc., etc. And so you had a number of really strong science fiction films, but usually they were thought of as B movies, sort of the second film on a two-film bill, lower budget, with a very few exceptions. You might get one great science fiction film every 10 years. That started to change in 1968 with 2001, which was a game changer. It was the top-grossing film of that year. It was obviously no science fiction film after 2001 could deliver the level of visual effects, the level of production design that they had gotten used to, because 2001 basically took it into a whole nother ballgame, a whole nother realm, and you saw the ripple effect of this through the 70s into the real game changers of that decade, which of course were Star Wars and Alien. And so we went through the 80s, we've talked about that. Now we're in the 90s, and a lot of the people who came to prominence in the 70s and 80s, people like James Cameron, George Lucas, Spielberg, you name it, Tim Burton, they by now were very, very major presences in cinema. And while you started to get a lot of sequels and a lot of knockoffs, low-budget knockoffs, you also still got a number of very original films that were not based on any previous movie, so they didn't have a numeral after their name, like 2, 3, 4, even though some good films did have those sequel numbers. So let's just get into it. We're going to go year by year and talk about the real high points. There's a lot of kind of dreck that we won't go into, but just know that it's there. But 1990, you have films like Back to the Future Part 3. Now, Back to the Future, of course, Robert Zemeckis, Michael J. Fox, had been a really fun film, a time travel film that twisted and turned and sent a young man from the modern era, which back then was the 80s, into the 1950s to try and make sure that his parents would get together and he would exist. And the sequel took us into the future, and the third one took us into the Wild West. And all three of them really fit together very nicely. Christopher Lloyd and Michael Fox have a terrific chemistry. The third one's still very, very fun, and Mary Steenburgen who had established herself in films like Time After Time, was just wonderful in this film as well, and she's continuing to be wonderful even unto this day. So that was a fun film, and again, that closed the trilogy. And interestingly enough, we haven't had Back to the Future films since then. Now, that might possibly partially be due to Michael J. Fox's diagnosis with Parkinson's. Who knows? Eventually, I'm sure someone will do another Back to the Future film that will be good or bad. We'll find out, won't we? But another film that came out that year was Darkman. And what you got through this decade were a number of films that tried to set up new superheroes, new franchises. In more recent times, we get a lot more superhero movies using the established superheroes, Superman, Batman, the Avengers, etc. But Sam Raimi, who had started in horror films, tried to do a film about a sort of a dark-edged kind of hero, and it had a good cast: Liam Neeson, Frances McDormand, but didn't quite click. It had its followers, but it was sort of like a midnight movie kind of thing. It didn't punch through. But then we get Edward Scissorhands. Now this was a unique film, a sort of a fantasy romance, but it deals with a scientist played by Vincent Price, who tries to create his own basically human-ish creature, but he has hands for scissors. And before he is completed, Vincent Price's character dies, and Johnny Depp, who had been coming off TV, who would later be famous for Pirates of the Caribbean, etc., was just phenomenal in this role as Edward Scissorhands, and very much in the Frankenstein mold of sort of a naive, very open-hearted, very loving creature who can easily be misunderstood, but this has a lighter touch to it, and is a sort of a romantic comedy slash quasi-horror film, but very light on the horror. Winona Ryder is wonderful in it. Anthony Michael Hall's in it. It's got wonderful visual design by Tim Burton, wonderful writing. It really hits the target that it's aiming for, and it's really, really a delightful film if you've never seen it. Here's the they've been releasing it in special editions. Here's the genuine article, and this has a lot of extras on it, and very, very fun film, and one of a kind. They never did Edward Scissorhands 2 or 3 or 4, thank God. And Johnny Depp in his youth was really remarkable in changing from film to film to film to film. He was a real chameleon, still is a bit of that, but his notoriety kind of eclipses that nowadays, whereas back then he was just a revelation in pretty much every role he did. So then we talked about Frankenstein, and you have the low budget knockoffs like Frankenhooker, which came out that same year. You've got a lot of these kind of films. You've got the Dragon Ball Z films, lots of Japanese imports, and a German director named Volker Schlondorf decided to make one of the great dystopian novels into a movie, and that was The Handmaid's Tale, and that starred Natasha Richardson, Robert Duvall, Faye Dunaway, Aidan Quinn, and it doesn't really nail it. It's a good try, everyone's working hard, but finally, decades later, they would have the TV series, and that would really have the canvas, the breathing room to really, really give us a look into what that story's about, what that world is about, and it's been greatly successful. And prior to this, generally, if a movie had been a failure, it would be very difficult to get another version of it made or a TV series of it made, because it tanked at the box office. This kind of took the curse off of that, because The Handmaid's Tale had been a total failure at the box office. It had been successful as a novel, Margaret Atwood, but by reinventing it, coming back, making it into a hit show, all of a sudden, all these films, all these properties that had not succeeded, Hollywood started looking at them again and seeing if they could reinvent and come up with new versions. So it was a very important point at which properties were revived that previously couldn't have been. But The Handmaid's Tale, it's interesting to watch it in light of the series, but the series is far superior. Same time, 1990, you get Hardware Wars, which is again a future dystopic robot kind of movie. It's directed by Richard Stanley, who's had a very up and down career. Some people really like this film. I'm not a big fan of it, but I admire its voice. And Richard Stanley then did Island of Dr. Moreau, got fired off his own movie, then came back as a beast man in disguise to observe it and talk about it and make a documentary focusing on it. And in more recent years, he did The Color Out of Space with Nicolas Cage and is kind of having a renaissance in his career. So let's hear it for tenacity and perseverance. So then we have, Martians Go Home, which is not successful, and Moon 44, which is a film starring Michael Pere, Malcolm McDowell, of course, from Clockwork Orange, Lisa Eichhorn, and it's directed by Roland Emmerich, who is a German director who would go on to greater things, but this is kind of him getting a foothold in American films. And lower budget science fiction film, you can check it out. Then we start to get, again, as I said, Back to the Future, you're starting to get a lot of sequels as well. Predator 2 comes out. That doesn't have Schwarzenegger in it, but does have Danny Glover, Gary Busey, and Kevin Peter Hall playing the creature. And a fun film. Some people really like it. Some people even prefer it to the original, the first film. I've always had a problem with Predator in that I think it has a very limited bag of tricks. It's not really been thought through very well, I don't think. And I feel that Alien versus Predator is kind of a bastardization of both franchises. I don't think there's ever been a great Predator movie. I mean, the first one's good, entertaining, but if they had really thought through those creatures in some kind of science fiction world building way, I think it could have been a lot better. And so, but that's my opinion, of course, and this is Mr. Sci-Fi, so I have my opinion. Then they did RoboCop 2. Well, again, you get Peter Weller playing the cop, the robotic cop. You have Nancy Allen returning. And this was directed by Irvin Kershner. And Irvin Kershner had distinguished himself as the director of The Empire Strikes Back. And RoboCop 2 is a fun film. It doesn't have that same... The first film, Paul Verhoeven, had such a satiric and anarchic aesthetic and sense of what he was up to. So RoboCop 2 is a fun movie, but again, RoboCop 1 is really the one to watch, particularly when you go into some other films we'll talk about later that he directed that are sort of a trilogy of very satiric, socially commenting films that have a wonderful style and wonderful performances and scripts and so forth. So then we got Robot Jox. Now, because again that RoboCop and Terminator kind of had put robots back on the map, you have a lot of lower budget ones. And Stuart Gordon, again, who had distinguished himself as a director with films like Reanimator, he decided to do this giant robot battling each other kind of movie. Now, Ron Cobb, who was the great political cartoonist and then became the great designer of science fiction films, Cobb was a good friend of mine. He had established himself as a film designer with films that he worked on, such as Star Wars and tons of stuff, Aliens and Alien and on and on. He was a designer on Robot Jox, and it's a fun film. It has stop motion animation by Dave Allen, who is one of the great stop motion animators. It's sort of a child of Ray Harryhausen, and really skilled. So it's a fun film worth checking out. Produced by the notorious Charlie Band, but. And then you have, Richard Sarafian directing Solar Crisis, Patrick Reed Johnson doing Spaced Invaders. These are all kind of low-budget, kind of midnight movie kind of films. Then you get Total Recall. Now, Total Recall, I have it somewhere in here. Yeah, here it is. This is the 4K version. Now, Schwarzenegger, there were two big action stars of that era, A-list action stars, Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, and they both were doing their explorations of science fiction through this period. And Schwarzenegger starred in Total Recall. It's based on Philip K. Dick short story called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, about sort of a nondescript fellow who wants to have a memory implanted that he's a spy on an adventure to Mars, and it turns out that he really is. And they have to figure out what to do after that. And they've awakened a submerged memory, deliberately submerged. And because the main character is sort of like this regular guy, Schwarzenegger was hardly the guy to star in that movie, but amazingly the film works and is wonderful and has great satirical stuff. And Robert Picardo plays Johnny Cab, this robot cab driver, which is very fun. It's a ridiculous film in many ways. For instance, just with Schwarzenegger's eyes popping out when he's in the Martian atmosphere, and then being able to put an Earth-like atmosphere in within moments so that he's saved. Every scientist in the universe groaned when he watched that scene. But the history of it is fascinating, which is that Ron Shusett and Dan O'Bannon had made their mark in cinema with Alien, And this was another film they came up with adapting Philip K. Dick. Blade Runner had put Philip K. Dick on the map in terms of becoming a property that could be adapted to cinema. Sadly, he didn't live to enjoy the riches of that. But by now, Philip K. Dick was like, okay, you can bank on that name. And so, but adapting a short story that basically has one gag in it, that one reveal, with a little twist at the end, very challenging. And so, so what they came up with was, let's have him go to Mars. Let's have a third act that takes place on Mars. And so they did that. And Ron Cobb did the designs on this film, and it is totally fun, and it has great practical effects by Rob Bottin, where the woman's head opens up to reveal Schwarzenegger, and then closes up, and he tosses it at the cops, and it blows up. It's wonderful stuff, and a highly entertaining film. And again, practical effects really help. Because it's a physicality to it, a solidity to it. It's there in the scene. So these are mechanical and makeup effects that are just phenomenal. But Rob Bottin would later go on to do The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, which is a masterpiece. But this film, if you've never seen Total Recall, it was remade with Colin Farrell, which is a good film, but not a great film, and this is far superior, as goofy as it is, and I highly recommend it. So so definitely check it out, and go back and read Philip K. Dick if you never have, because he is absolutely one of a kind and an amazing writer. So then we get to 1991. They make a sequel. They have Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, and previously they'd made the first Bill and Ted's Adventure. And it was fun. It had Keanu Reeves and Alex Winter in very delightful roles as kind of these less than genius people, but very affable. It was an affable film, and Chris Matheson, Richard Matheson's son, was one of the writers, and it was quite delightful. And this is the sequel. Now, many years later, like 30 years later, they just made another Bill and Ted film, which Elaine and I just watched, which we actually liked. I mean, they're not great films, but they're so incredibly pleasant. And this is before Keanu Reeves had established himself as an action hero. Later with Speed, he would do that, and also then of course The Matrix, which would be his big breakout film. But he, prior to this, he had established himself as sort of like this kind of not exactly a doper kid, but kind of like a Valley kind of kid, a kind of an affable, surferish kind of kid, and sometimes he'd be in dramas, sometimes he'd be in comedies, playing basically that guy. And I think Keanu Reeves, from what I've heard, is a really nice guy, and I think that niceness comes through, and also his work ethic. So I think he seems to be like someone who's really loved in the industry, and the fact that he would come back 30 years later and do another Bill and Ted movie, when obviously, given his career, he would not have to. That's really to his credit, and so if you haven't seen the Bill and Ted, films, they're worth checking out. They're fun. They're really fun. And so then you have a lot of like lower knockoff films like Critters. Critters 3 comes out this year. More Dragon Ball Z movies. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. They're continuing to do these Japanese Godzilla films. The Guyver films. Those are again, these are kind of like at this point you start to have blockbuster videos, so you'd go and you'd rent a couple movies on for a weekend, and you might the girlfriend or the wife wants that romance film, and so you say, well, there's the Guyver, or there's this science fiction movie, let's get the action film, and then that's the compromise, and so forth. So Nicholas Sparks versus James Cameron. So then you get Cronenberg, one of the great horror directors, doing Naked Lunch, which is with Peter Weller of RoboCop, and Judy Davis, who's a great actress, and Ian Holm, who had been in Alien and would be in Fifth Element, and that's an adaptation of the William Burroughs novel, and really a strange film. Cronenberg deals a lot with body horror, and so this is very much in that tradition, but kind of. William Burroughs has worked in science fiction elements and horror elements, and he, of course, is famous for having been a junkie, and and written about that. So it's so this again continues Cronenberg's weird journey. So, but again, a interesting and well done film. Then we get to, now we're starting to get back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, superheroes were just basically relegated to camp and cheesy kind of stuff, Republic serials and things like that. It's only as you get into the 70s you start to get Christopher Reeve's Superman. Tim Burton ultimately does Batman, and so you start to get more and more superhero films. And The Rocketeer, which is based on a comic book / graphic novel, series of graphic novels by Dave Stevens, it was beautifully drawn by Dave Stevens. He brought Betty Page back. He used Betty Page as sort of the model for the girlfriend, at least visually, in Rocketeer. And there had been a Republic serial, several Republic serials, and also a TV show about a fellow who had a flying belt, zombies of the stratosphere, that kind of stuff. And he had a rocket belt that would say up, down, left, right, and take off and go flying, and he'd wear a mask. And so The Rocketeer was very much a callback to those films and those TV shows. And so it stars Billy Campbell and Jennifer Connelly, who's wonderful, of course, in pretty much everything she does. Alan Arkin, Timothy Dalton, Paul Sorvino, solid cast. Joe Johnston was the director, and it's a film that should have worked and should have gotten a franchise going, and it's really a shame that it didn't. It somehow just didn't click with audiences, and it was a Disney film, and who knows why. But sadly, Dave Stevens died very young. He was a phenomenal talent as a writer and an artist, particularly as an artist. If you've never looked at the comic work of Dave Stevens, definitely check it out. He was really in the top rank of artists, and The Rocketeer is a delightful piece of work, and hopefully someone will revive it again. It just needs the right mixture of elements, and it can take off. But this is a film that's entertaining and just is kind of, not for want of trying, definitely not for want of trying, but one of the ones that kind of missed the brass ring. Then you get the same year, you get Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. Now the Star Trek films, of course, Star Trek the motion picture had been done in 1979. It brought back the original Star Trek cast after over 10 years, or about 10 years from the cancellation of the show. By now you had a huge fandom base for Star Trek. Star Trek: The Next Generation had debuted on television, and but they were Star Trek: The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager. There was Star Trek series being done on television throughout the 90s, and then also the Star Trek movies continued from the 70s through the 80s through the 90s, and basically they alternated between good ones and bad ones. I personally love the director's cut of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Star Trek Wrath of Khan is probably the greatest of the Star Trek movies. Wonderful job by Nicholas Meyer and everyone. Star Trek 3 was less good. Star Trek 4, They Saved the Whales, another good film. Star Trek 5 was the one that Shatner directed, really kind of some real groaning moments. All of the Star Trek films have things you can appreciate, but each time the cast is getting older and older and older. People are noticing this, and the question is, how many of these can they do before it's finally like enough? So Star Trek VI was the last feature film to focus only on the original cast, and they brought back Nicholas Meyer, who'd both been one of the writers and the director on Wrath of Khan, wrote the script for Star Trek IV, and he comes back as director on Star Trek VI, and it's a really good film. David Warner, who had played Jack the Ripper in Time After Time, which was written and directed by Nick Meyer, came back to play a Klingon. This film very much commented on detente, what was happening between the U.S. and the USSR at that point. It's like, can we trust the Russians? Can we make peace with the Russians? Those are very, and it really feels kind of shoehorned in. Having Kirk as sort of this hard, far-right conservative kind of guy because his son was murdered by the Klingons, and you can't trust a Klingon, and having Spock trying to make, find the road to peace, and having some of the, it's a little bit weird how that all works. But that said, it's a fun film. David Warner's very, very good. Most of the cast is very good. You've got wonderful actors and actresses. You have, they were going to have Savick as sort of the spy, the traitor in this, and wisely decided not to have her. And the actress who plays the Vulcan traitor ultimately would go on to Sex and the City and make her bones there. But she's a very solid actress and quite wonderful and very good in this. And so again, if you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. It's fun. It's a little bit hokey, but works. And though Spock's ears are a little funny, people commented on that. They're a little funky. Now, the next film we get to from this year is one of the great all-time films and one of my absolute favorites, and that is Terminator 2: Judgment Day. Ba-da-da-da. And again, Schwarzenegger doing hit after hit in science fiction, coming off Total Recall. Now, of course, Schwarzenegger had really, his career had gone into the stratosphere with Terminator, which was a huge hit. And then of course, he did, then Cameron, and that put James Cameron on the map, and then Cameron did Aliens, and they reunite for Terminator 2. And this has great work by, the script is great, the movie is great, it's been done, it's just a phenomenal film. Edward Furlong is one of the greatest kid performers of all time in this film. It's just a total great piece of work, and it really carved itself out, saying you can have a sequel. Many people believe that the sequel is better than the original. I like both of them, but this certainly had more money, and there's less kind of moments where you go, that doesn't look quite right, that could have been done better. This one, they pulled out all the stops, and they've tried subsequently to make great Terminator movies, and some of them I like, some of them I don't, but the first two are absolutely, if you're gonna watch a Terminator movie, those are the two to watch. And Schwarzenegger's great in this, and they twist it so that he's the good guy in this one, whereas he had been the bad guy in the first one. And of course, Linda Hamilton is spectacular in this as well. So really a great job. So then we have low budget films continuing with Trancers and things like that, and Wim Wenders does Until the End of the World, but none of these are kind of kicking butt and taking names. But then we get to 1992, and that's when you get a very odd film, Alien 3. Now, Alien 3 is directed by David Fincher, who went on to become one of the great directors of all time, with many dark films. And this, he was very young here, and the problem with this is, because Aliens was such a huge success, and Alien, of course, had been, they wanted to do a third one, and they went through draft after draft after draft after draft. Now, one of the great drafts was by a writer named William Gibson, and he wrote this book, Neuromancer, which is the great cyberpunk novel. Now, he was hugely influenced by Blade Runner. And so now the genre fiction in literature is being influenced by film and vice versa. And so William Gibson, and this is a recent edition of this, and this is what William Gibson looks like. And this is him signing this to me. And we were on a panel together. Well, we were doing a signing at a convention years and years ago, long before Alien 3, and he leaned over to me and asked me how to get into writing film and TV. So by the time of Alien 3, they hired William Gibson to write his Alien 3, and he couldn't but contractually, Sigourney Weaver only wanted to do a small role, but Newt and Hicks and Lance Henriksen also were in it. And it's a wonderful script, and fortunately for the 40th anniversary, or whatever anniversary it is of Alien, they did both a graphic novel of it, a very good adaptation, and an audio play adaptation with Lance Henriksen and Hicks. And so a fan took those and combined them into an animatic, a full-length Alien 3 that you can watch. And that's here on Mr. Sci-Fi. If you just search out Alien 3, you'll find it. So I highly recommend that. It's much better than the version of Alien 3 that was made. Now, the version of Alien 3 that was made had nothing to do with William Gibson. It basically was they had, at one point, one draft, they had this idea of doing it as this wood planet made out of wood, and it was like a space station planet made of wood with monks in it who were sort of like anti-technology, and it's just like, Jesus Christ, and they got rid of that director who developed that one, and it evolved into sort of this convict world, and they kill off Newt at the beginning, they kill off Hicks, Lance Henriksen is gone, and it's just a very problematical film, and some people really like it. I don't. It has a solid cast: Charles Dance, and Charles Dutton, and Paul McGann, who would later be in other great things. But Sigourney Weaver shaves her head. It's dark and creepy and funky, and the problem also was that David Fincher, he was being overridden by the studio executives, and he was hired at the last minute. He had to kind of hit the ground running, and whereas he would have wanted to do a lot of changes to that script, the studio executives said, "You don't know what you're doing. Just shoot what's written." And because he was young and didn't have really that authority yet that he would have in later years, he just kind of went along with it, and really regrets it now. And it's a shame, lost opportunity, but that's the way it goes. That's showbiz, guys. So, so then you get, that same year you get some lower budget kind of science fiction things that are kind of marginally entertaining, like Free Jack, which has Emilia Estevez and Mick Jagger, who had an acting career at that point, Anthony Hopkins, Rene Russo, solid actors, solid cast. Godzilla vs. Mothra comes out that year. Honey, I Blew Up the Kid, which is a sequel to Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, another Rick Moranis movie. Rick Moranis, of course, was great in Ghostbusters previously. But, just an okay film. Randall Kleiser directed it. Lawnmower Man comes out. That's sort of a horror, science fiction kind of film, which is based loosely on a Stephen King piece of work. But, Pierce Brosnan's in it, of course. Around that time, he was playing, 007. But again, a lesser film, not really one you need to, put on your list of great films to watch. And it continues. There's just, various and sundry others that might be your personal favorite. Roland Emmerich stepped up a little with Universal Soldier, which was a Jean-Claude Van Damme movie with Dolph Lundgren in it. And that starts moving him more and more into science fiction, moving him more and more into having a little more money to play with. And then we get to 1993. And my friend Joe Dougherty wrote Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, which Christopher Guest, later of Spinal Tap, would direct. And Christopher Guest also did Best in Show. And that starred Daryl Hannah. And again, she had become a movie star based on Splash, based on Blade Runner. And she was quite charming, quite wonderful throughout this period. Many films that she did were wonderful. If you haven't seen Splash, check it out. Obviously, you've seen Blade Runner if you're watching Mr. Sci-Fi. But if you haven't seen Roxanne with her and Steve Martin, a modern updating of Cyrano de Bergerac, do it. She's just totally charming. And this is a fun film. And Joe Dougherty, who wrote it, is doing the Showrunners Network with me, and was an esteemed executive producer and Emmy winner on many shows subsequent to this, Judging Amy and Saving Grace, and most recently Pretty Little Liars. But a talented writer, a talented man, and Christopher Guest is a talented director and great comic actor, and so definitely check it out if you can. And now we also have another remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Now at this point we'd have the original in the 50s, the Don Siegel directed with Kevin McCarthy. Then you had the sequel with Jeff Goldblum and Donald Sutherland and Veronica Cartwright, that was made in a previous decade to this. Then you get a third one, and this was directed by Abel Ferrara, good director, and it starred Meg Tilly and Terry Kinney, who would later be in Lost, and also Forrest Whitaker, who's been in any number of great things. And it's an interesting film. Nicole Kidman would later make her version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which was very problematical in many ways. This is not the great version of that story. It's based on a novel by Jack Finney, but it's interesting to check out. I really like Meg Tilly. She's Jennifer Tilly's sister, and she's very, very, very good. She's worth watching, and this film is worth checking out. But it doesn't have that solid grounding that the first two Invasion of the Body Snatchers movies have. But it's an interesting take on it. Then you get, Carnosaur and Coneheads, which is a film based on the Saturday Night Live skits about aliens coming to Earth, and Cyborg 2 and Cyborg Cop, another play on RoboCop. And then you get Demolition Man. Now, we mentioned that Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger were the two big action stars, these big muscle guys. And so Stallone does a film, Demolition Man, in which he's a cop who's frozen, and he's brought back out of the deep freeze to capture another fellow who's been frozen, a villain played by Wesley Snipes. It has Sandra Bullock when she was not a movie star yet, not a big A-list talent, and she's very fun in it. It parodies product placement. It's a fun action film. I mean, I liked it. If you like Total Recall, you're gonna like this film, and it's got a lot of fun stuff in it, and it pays off, and it's solid, and not as well remembered anymore, but a good film and a fun film. So definitely check it out if you've never seen it. Then we get Fire in the Sky, which Tracy Torme, who would later create Sliders, was instrumental in getting made, and it stars D.B. Sweeney and Robert Patrick from Terminator 2, who was great in that movie, by the way. And it's basically about a supposedly true story of a young fellow who was abducted by aliens. You can check it out if you're into UFOs. It's worth taking a look at. Then we have Fortress, which was starred Christopher Lambert, who's also, of course, in Highlander, and it's another Stuart Gordon film, and not a classic, but it has Kurtwood Smith, and almost anything with Kurtwood Smith is fun to watch. And again, if you're trying to watch the films you've never seen, you could do worse than watch that film. Then we get to another heavy hitter, Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park. Now this is the book by Michael Crichton, and I loved signed editions, and this one, let's see if I can find where Mr. Crichton signed this. Yeah, here it is. There's Michael Crichton's signature. Now, Michael Crichton was an amazing writer. He had studied to be a doctor, but did not ultimately become a practicing doctor, and he went on to create ER. He created Westworld, which he also directed, the original Yul Brynner version. Wrote blockbuster novel after blockbuster novel, and tried his hand at directing in features, and so the same year that Steven Spielberg and he did ER on television, they did Jurassic Park in films, and this is what the film's key art looks like. They later reissued it in 3D. It did not originally come out in 3D, but it was the great dinosaur movie. Those of us who'd grown up loving dinosaurs and enjoying dinosaurs in every film that we could watch a dinosaur in, whether they were stop motion or we always hated ones where they used Gila monsters and put like little things on them, and those were always horrible, and hand puppets, those were always horrible. And so we all longed for a great dinosaur movie. And this is a little kid oriented, it's a little funky, it's a little overly sweet, but but it's still great. The dinosaurs are terrific, and the cast isn't bad either. Sam Neill, Laura Dern, Jeff Goldblum. I mean, solid. And so the fun part about Jurassic Park was that Michael Crichton had lots of successes in books, lots of successes in film, and he was kind of trying to figure out what to do next. And with Westworld, he'd come up with the idea of an amusement park with a technological twist that basically goes haywire and starts killing people. And it was a successful movie, but kind of not an A-list movie, but a good film, and people loved it, and it was financially successful. But he had this odd idea, which was, what if you took that plot and put dinosaurs in it instead? Now that's a very ballsy move, because you're essentially ripping off yourself, and the entire world is going to know it, because everyone's going to know. He's, oh gosh, is this guy out of ideas? He's taken Westworld and just it could have been called Westworld with robots, Westworld with dinosaurs, and so but he did it, and Spielberg loved it and bought it, and so the book was a huge success, and the movie even more so, and they came right on the heels of each other, and you can tell that the book is written to be made into a movie. It's very cinematic. It's very clear what's up, and so. But the movie has Stan Winston working on the dinosaurs. And you've got visual effects. You have VFX dinosaurs and physical, full-sized animatronic dinosaurs, and it just works great. And it's a great fantasy of the idea of an amusement park with real dinosaurs. And Samuel L. Jackson's in it, and he's really fun in it. And it's a great film I can take exception with it in various little moments, like putting your hand in the dinosaur dung and all these kind of moments that you're gonna want. It's like kids. It's made for kids to all go you. It's a family film. You take your family to it, and there's a lot of goofy stuff in it, but it's still great. It's still great, and wonderful to see dinosaurs, and wonderful to see. Spielberg. The fascinating thing about this is the same year Spielberg did Schindler's List, and so in a way he's leaving the kind of film he did before behind and starting to move into very much more adult fare. And so this was a great turning point. But the fact that he would do these two huge, successful movies the same year is just amazing, and a testament to his ability and his work ethic. And but Jurassic Park was done by Universal. When I was a producer on Sliders, we had access to everything that Universal had made in terms of prop sets, costumes, etc. And so I did an episode of Sliders that utilized stuff from Jurassic Park, and that was because I asked if we could use that stuff, and they said yes. And so that was very, very fun. And when we were producing Sliders and On the Lot and utilizing all these great things, so that Jurassic Park was really the movie that took everyone. It just like knocked everyone back, and it's of course spawned many sequels leading into the current day's Jurassic World movies. And you can like them or not like them. But the interesting thing also is that since then, paleontology has discovered other things, like the fact that they knew back then that dinosaurs evolved into birds, but they didn't know how linked birds and dinosaurs were. And it turns out that it looks like most dinosaurs actually had feathers or feather-like structures. But now, because what dinosaurs look like is so ingrained in the public imagination, they're deliberately choosing not to have dinosaurs in the more recent movies look like the way dinosaurs did. Now, there's certain other films and TV shows and documentaries that do present dinosaurs in a much more accurate way, but Jurassic Park has kind of set the mold for the Jurassic Park movies in terms of what dinosaurs are going to be and what they're going to be able to do. Still, the book is a lot of fun. It has a lot more scenes that aren't in the movie. So if you want to read a fun little book, I can recommend it. Sadly, Michael Crichton is not with us anymore, but he has certainly left a legacy of amazing imagination, and it can definitely be credited as one of the great science fiction visionaries. And this book, at that point they were trying to crack the human genome. Genetic research was very much in the news, and the idea of how would you bring dinosaurs back was a very fun idea to play with. The idea that you could go into amber and find dinosaur DNA from mosquitoes, that had sucked the blood of dinosaurs and make dinosaurs. It's not actually technically possible at this stage, but it was a very engaging and fun idea, and the movie certainly works great. The same year you get Meteor Man, which is Robert Townsend had made a name for himself making a film with credit cards, and so now he was a little more established, so he directed this film starring himself as sort of a quasi-superhero. Didn't really make much of a dent. Philadelphia Experiment was a film based on this supposed story from World War II of a battleship being transported, being teleported, which is really a load of crap, of course. But they tried to make it into a film here with Brad Johnson. Okay, again, if you're looking for something to watch on a Friday night and you have a bowl of popcorn and go for it. RoboCop 3 comes out. Fred Decker's in that, directed it. Nancy Allen is still in it. The great Rip Torn is in it, but Peter Weller had left by this point. Robot Wars, another Albert Band robot film, comes out, and okay, good, more power to him. So then you move into 1994, and you get Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, there's a young fella who had just transitioned into writing and directing movies, and he wrote his favorite novel was Frankenstein. In fact, this was Frank Darabont, and he was a friend of mine, and I actually gave him the movie tie-in hardback from the original Frankenstein, the Boris Karloff one, and for his birthday, and that because he just loves Frankenstein. And by the way, for those who don't know, there are two versions of the novel. There's the 1818 one that Mary Shelley wrote. She was a teenager when she wrote Frankenstein, by the way, and then she married Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was a poet, and he kind of tweaked it for the 1833 edition. It's a little, I prefer the 1818 one myself. It's much closer to her vision and her voice. So that would be the one I would recommend that you read. They're texturally different, but they basically present the same story. And Dr. Frankenstein's basically a self-centered jerk, and he creates this monster, and the monster has a hard time of it. So Frank wanted to write a screenplay that would be a much more faithful adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and so he wrote Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now many directors and writers have wanted to do their own version of Frankenstein, and it's very elusive, very difficult to do well, because the Karloff Frankenstein is so iconic, and Boris Karloff was just so brilliant in the 3 Frankenstein movies he did, just superb, particularly Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. Amazing films, amazing performances. But Guillermo del Toro for many years considered doing Frankenstein with Doug Jones as the monster. Now it's a little too late for Doug to play the monster, so I don't know if we'll ever see that film. I doubt it, because Guillermo wanted, basically he knew that if he was going to do that film, it would have to be spectacular. It would have to just really knock it out of the park. You couldn't do it in half measures. So we'll see if that ever comes to fruition. That may be, an opportunity that's gone by, sadly. But because Doug Jones, who's in Space Command, would have been great in that as well. He's great in everything he does. But so Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So Kenneth Branagh, who was a great Shakespearean actor and started making his name as a director, took this on to direct it. And Frank Darabont told me, because I asked him about this movie, because it was a real misfire. And Frank would go on to direct Shawshank Redemption, Mist, Walking Dead, and he was the showrunner on Walking Dead for the first season. I said, well, why this movie go so awry? And Frank said, it was funny. I watched the filming of it, and it was really like they had all left, all the cast and crew had left the script in the hotel, and they were trying to shoot it from memory. And so it just kind of was like off the mark, and that's not what really happened. Of course, Kenneth Branagh had his vision, quote unquote, of what he wanted it to be, and that's what he ran with. But it's very overdrawn and operatic, and it has Robert De Niro as the monster, which I really didn't like that casting. And Kenneth Branagh plays Dr. Frankenstein. You have Tom Hulce coming off on Amadeus, and Helena Bonham Carter, and John Cleese, and it's just a misfire. And it's not a film I'm fond of at all. It was produced by Francis Ford Coppola. Great pedigree, but just didn't kind of do it for me. But the same year, you get another film that actually I very much like, which is Stargate. Roland Emmerich now he and his partners are ramping up ultimately to do Independence Day, which I think is their great science fiction film. But Stargate's a very good film, and it's got Kurt Russell, James Spader, Jay Davidson, who had come off The Crying Game. It's a really, really, really fun film. I like it very much. Watch it in the director's version, because that's the version that has all the little character beats. It's funny, back then, they wanted films to have a very specific running time so they could have a certain number of screenings in the theaters. And as a result, if a film was over 2 hours, they would say to the director, cut scenes out. And often they would cut out the character beats, because the character beats didn't impair the plot making sense. But taking out the character beats took out all the humanity. And this happened with The Abyss, and it happened with Star Trek The Motion Picture, and it happened with Stargate. So if you watch any of those films, make sure you watch the director's cut, because the theatrical release versions really are not the film you should be watching. It doesn't deliver the way that the full versions do. So Stargate, of course, is about some soldiers and a scientist who go through a stargate to an alien planet where basically the ancient Egyptian gods, or God, have been, it follows the Egyptian design motif on the idea that these guys were our masters way back when. And it's a really fun film. The visual effects are very, very good. I actually own part of the pyramid from that movie, and the Stargate pyramid. It's it's a really good one. Now you could say that, and James Spader, of course, went on to many, many other films and TV shows. Sex, Lies, and Videotape was, of course, the film that put him on the map. He's a very, very solid actor, and he had he was very young and handsome, and has a very specific kind of look back then, which he no longer has. He looks very different now. And of course, Kurt Russell This is not Kurt Russell's greatest role. I would say The Thing might be his greatest role, in my opinion. He's spectacular in that, and he's great in Big Trouble in Little China, many other films that we'll get to. But this, he's very good in this. He's playing a military man, sort of a lockdown type, lockdown character. But it's a really fun film, a really sweet film, romantic, and really kind of has that sense of imagination, the suspending of disbelief that really takes you to another place. It spun off as a very successful series of TV shows, TV series. Sadly, the filmmakers did not get a piece of the action on that because of the way their deal was structured. But the original film is worth checking out, and I like it. And it's really one of the great science fiction films in its way. Then you also got another Star Trek movie that year, which was Star Trek Generations, and this was when they tried to hand off the baton from the original Star Trek cast to the Star Trek The Next Generation cast. Basically, the way it worked in the TV shows were they had 7-year contracts. So the Star Trek series, Next Gen, DS9, Voyager, only would run 7 years, because at that point they'd have to renegotiate the contracts for the actors, and the salaries would go up so exponentially. The Paramount decided it was just better to start over again and do a new one. But because Star Trek The Next Generation was a big success, they didn't want to lose that magic, of that cast. So they then promoted them up to the movies, to the motion pictures. And so this is the first one that has Patrick Stewart and Jonathan Frakes and so forth, but it also has William Shatner, and it's William Shatner's death, and Captain Kirk's death, I should say. And they had really written Spock out well in Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. His death was very fitting and very appropriate. Then, of course, they brought him back. But in this one, William Shatner's death is very much kind of, it's not emotionally satisfying, and the fans were not happy with it. Malcolm McDowell's in this. It's not one of his great roles. It's an okay film, but not a great film, and very kind of weird. And Patrick Stewart and William Shatner's acting styles are so different from each other. It's very weird to have them in scenes together, just because it's almost like these two universes should not meet. I think Shatner, I've said this before, that Shatner is the greatest bad actor in the history of film and television. He's the only one who can do all of those mannerisms that he has, and all of that weird Shatner way of performing that he has, and pull it off. Anyone who tries to imitate him, they are ludicrous. And he avoids that. He manages somehow to go into this William Shatner persona and this William Shatner style that he can pull off, but no one else can. He just had his 90th birthday. I hope he lives forever. He's amazing and unique and has an amazing amount of energy even now. Sadly, we're losing so many of our original Star Trek cast, but any chance to watch him is a delight in its way. Even though this film is not that good a film, it was a success. It was enough of a financial success to convince Paramount to keep making the Star Trek movies, and that would then lead to the next few that had a lot more to give the audience. So now at the same time, Peter Hyams, who had done 2010, who had done many films that were notable, including Outland. I have an Outland spacesuit over there, and another one over here. But he did Time Cop, and Jean-Claude Van Damme was in it. Ron Silver, Mia Sara, and it's a time travel film. The concept is really interesting, and again, not an A-list film, but an interesting one. And it spun off into a TV series, and those sets were terrific. And when they canceled the Time Cop show, they were just going to tear down the sets, and I came up with an idea for sliders that would utilize those sets, and so we did an episode called Slide Cage that I wrote and produced, and it utilized all those sets. So thank you, Time Cop. Peter Hyams has been a very kind of a hit and miss director, but his films, I think Outland's worth watching, and certainly 2010 is worth watching. So that was another of one of his science fiction entries. A lot of directors working very, very much in the science fiction genre during this period, and to great effect. And there was a sense of the energy they were all watching each other's work, and and kind of these, in many cases, that energy of watching each other. We were all watching each other's work, even in television. I was very friendly with the people doing Babylon 5 and the people doing Star Trek, and when I was doing Sliders and also writing for Babylon 5 and Star Trek: The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. So we were all sort of a fraternity of people, sort of whose heads were in that same groove. We were doing science fiction because we loved it. We absolutely, and I love it still, of course, which is why I'm still doing it. And you get the love of it coming through in these films, even if they're, B movies, even the lesser ones. You know that the people like Stuart Gordon and Peter Hyams and Frank Marshall, all of these people who are working in this genre, they love the genre. They're not cynics by any means. Some of the real crap films, those guys are cynical, those guys are skimming off the top, those guys are just trying to make a buck. But certainly most of that core of people doing genre films during this period are doing, they have the job that they've always dreamed of, and they're just trying their best. And sometimes they hit a single, and sometimes they hit a home run, and it's just, everyone's really trying. There's also a really good documentary about the model makers, because this is the great era of models, miniatures that seamlessly connect with the full-size versions of the vehicles and the buildings and the props and all that stuff. And there's a documentary. I'll have to bring it out next time and tell you what the title of it is. But it's a great documentary, and it goes into the making of a lot of these films. So we get into 1995. We've got City of Lost Children, which is a French film, and it's odd, extremely odd, but phenomenal visual design. It has Ron Perlman in it, who would go on to be in movies like Hellboy, and was around that time he was in Beauty and the Beast, the TV show, and but this was yet another thing that established him as an actor of note. And it was a French film, but French-Spanish-German co-production, and it was directed by two guys, Marc Caro and Jean-Pierre Junot. And Jean-Pierre Junot, off the heat of the success of this film, would get the gig to direct Alien 4. And we'll talk about that in the near future. But this film is an interesting film to watch. It's odd and strange and intriguing. I don't know if I actually like it. There's a whole genre of films that I can't say I like, but I find them interesting, and this is one of those, and definitely stands out, and is sort of one of a kind in that way. So check it out. It's worth checking out. But then we move on to, and we're getting a lot of these, Dragon Ball Z is still making movies, Cyborg 3, Cyborg Cop 2, all these things are getting made, over and over and over again, martial arts films, Galaxis, Gamera, all this stuff, that's in these little kind of, neighborhood theaters and showing up late at night on television and so forth. But then we get to another landmark film, which is Ghost in the Shell. Now, I mentioned earlier, Blade Runner. Here's the lineage. Here's the DNA of all of this stuff. Philip K. Dick was writing in the science fiction genre. He was writing for maybe 5 cents a word. Maybe he'd get paid $1,000 for a novel, maybe $3,000. There's one year that he wrote 12 novels in 1 year. I mean, this guy was astonishingly prolific. Some of his novels were great, like Man in the High Castle. Others were interesting, but not entirely successful artistically. But he was just pounding it out. And he was a brilliant writer. And whereas he was writing with the tropes of all his brother writers like Theodore Sturgeon and Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, they were all writing in the same, using the same bag of tricks. So it was all space travel and space colonization and alien invasion and time travel and all the things that basically H.G. Wells and Jules Verne had kind of like grandfathered. But Philip K. Dick was different in one key way, which was he had this vision of the future that he basically utilized in a lot of his books, such as Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which then was made into Blade Runner. He had this vision of a future that was highly technological, that had androids that were not like human beings. They did not have empathy. He had flying cars. He had all of this stuff. It was a very interesting view of a future that was technologically advanced with all these goodies that we were told we were going to have, but also had very, very neurotic and messed up people. people dealing with their own neurosis. And Philip K. Dick certainly had a lot of neurosis. He was taking a lot of drugs. You know, he was a very, very, very wild character, but a very strong writer. And luckily, he, just as Arthur C. Clarke was blessed to team with Stanley Kubrick, who was able to fully visualize what Arthur C. Clarke was writing about, Philip K. Dick got Ridley Scott, and he was able to see footage of the city that Ridley Scott was making with Doug Trumbull, who had just come off 2001, and Philip K. Dick said, "My God, this is what I see in my head. How did you know? How did you see this?" And that vision, and how wonderful Blade Runner was with the noirish vision of the future, inspired William Gibson to write Neuromancer, and that was how cyberpunk got coined. And then that was feeding back cyberpunk, and the writers who were writing cyberpunk and the filmmakers who were making cyberpunk, future noir. It was all this wonderful, brilliant cultural stew. And so in 1995 we get Ghost in the Shell, the animated film. Now we previously had Akira. The Japanese were doing just astonishing things with animation, but Ghost in the Shell really was a child of Neuromancer, a child of Blade Runner, and really was highly influential in terms of books afterwards, films afterwards, animation, television, you name it. And recently, of course, there was a live action Ghost in the Shell, which was not good, but that film really, really, really worked. And let's see, somewhere over here I have that film, so let me show it to you. Here it is, Ghost in the Shell. This is the most recent version. It's been spiffed up. It's in 4K, and I think they've also recently done a sort of a more CG realistic version, which I have not yet seen. But it's a great piece of work, and really beautiful, and really tells a great story, and just works in every way. So I recommend it. It definitely is one of the standout films. And but definitely, you know, the fingerprints of what's gone before are all over it, and you know, so forth. Now the same year, now as you know, with Neuromancer, William Gibson this won the Hugo, this won the Nebula, this swept the field, it won everything, and is, you know, one of the landmark novels of science fiction if you've never read it. But and they were trying to make a movie of this, and it went on and on, people trying to adapt it. No one could skin that cat. No one could get it made. But at that point, William Gibson had a short story called Johnny Mnemonic, which is a great title, and it was a short story, and it was made into a film. Now, Keanu Reeves, this is before The Matrix, and Keanu Reeves is in it. He's starting to dip his toe into science fiction, and starting to move into the action genre. And it also has Dolph Lundgren, who's been in many of the other science fiction films, and of course was in Rocky, one of the Rocky sequels. And it's not a great film. It's an interesting film. The visual design on it is poor, and that really kind of hinders it. You know, you need great visual design, and guys like Ron Cobb and Ridley Scott were at the forefront of making science fiction films. You know, Cobb told me of the first night I met him when I was 16, he took me back to his place, and he had just done the 10 concept paintings that ultimately would sell Alien. And they were astonishing paintings. And he showed me other illustrations he had done, because I always noticed in his political cartoons that his spaceships and his aliens and his robots always looked amazing. And he told me that when he was in the 1950s, he had tried with a friend of his to start a company that would make science fiction props. And he had designed a robot where it was someone would be inside of it, but the way it moved, you could never guess how any human being could be inside of it. And he was one of the great visionary designers, but back in the 50s, he couldn't convince anyone to hire him. And so fortunately, thank God, he met Dan O'Bannon on Dark Star and did the design of the ship, the spaceship in Dark Star. And then when Dan O'Bannon hired him to do this concept work on Alien, the concept paintings, and then that led to him being in Jodorowsky's Dune as part of the design team, and then that team en masse went to work on Alien when Ridley Scott came aboard it, and then Cobb was one of the principal designers from then on in the science fiction films. You know, but if a film didn't have that kind of visionary director, didn't have that kind of visionary production designer, you would get films where it was like kind of hokey, kind of not all there. And so for me, Johnny Mnemonic is one of those. A film that's interesting. The technology stuff is very dated by now. It's like, someone plugs something in and it's an incredible brain-destroying file that's like, 1 megabyte. Oh my God, 1 megabyte now fits on, something like that. But it's a fun film. It's a fun film to watch. So we also get Judge Dredd that year. Now, Judge Dredd, now I'd mentioned Stallone was a big action star. Well, this is another one of his big action movies, starring Armand Asante, Diane Lane, Rob Schneider. Rob Schneider's kind of funky in this, but it's an attempt to do the first film version of a character who is much more well-known in the UK. Judge Dredd's Adventures appeared in 2000 AD, which was a magazine. It was illustrated by the same artist, Dave Gibbons, who had done Watchmen, which was a landmark graphic novel. And this film is not a great film. The look of it is good. And my friend Bill Maher, not the one on HBO, was a comic artist at the time. He was doing work for Judge Dredd. So you can see Judge Dredd there holding up this kind of creepy looking guy, and it says, Dredd says, "Give it up, punk." So so that was sort of the so I haven't really read Judge Dredd in the comics, so I don't know the character well, but from those who are fans of that version of Judge Dredd, they really didn't like this movie. They felt that Stallone's Judge Dredd was not in keeping with the character in the comics. And Armand Asante, there's a lot of yelling in this movie, and it's I like Demolition Man better than this film. Stallone looked good in the outfit, but it takes more than that. Later, you'd have another version of this made with Carl Urban that apparently is a little closer, but you still haven't had the great Judge Dredd movie by all accounts, and but Carl Urban apparently was closer to the mark, and that version has Lena Headey, I guess, however it's pronounced, from Game of Thrones, and she's very, very good in that movie as well. So then you continue on to Species. Now, Species is 2/3 of a good movie. It's after Alien, H.R. Giger was in demand as a designer. He was this brilliant, unique artist, and Jodorowsky's the one who got him to work on Dune, and then Ridley Scott via Dan O'Bannon, who worked on Jodorowsky's Dune, one of the great unmade films of all time, then brought him onto Alien, and that made H.R. Giger's reputation into the world. He was a well-known artist working, in galleries and doing paintings and stuff, but this really put him on the map. And so Species was a science fiction film very much in that Alien mold, but the idea was actually very solid, which is that an alien species sends sort of coding on DNA via transmission, and our scientists build this creature, and it looks like a human female, but it grows very quickly, and actually it's not human at all, and it's basically trying to convey its DNA and get basically its species going here on Earth. And it's a really cool film for most of it. It's directed by Roger Donaldson, who was a very solid director. He stars Natasha Henstridge as the adult version of this creature, and she's very beautiful. And Ben Kingsley's in it, and Michael Madsen's in it. It's got a name cast, and the visual stuff that Giger does is really good. The creature is really good, and there's on YouTube there's a making of featurette on this that goes into detail about how much Giger designed that was not used in this film, but phenomenal design stuff, just amazing. And the problem with H.R. Giger, of course, is that he's so distinctive that anytime he does anything on a film, it looks like, well, they're ripping off Alien because it's that aesthetic. It's very specific. But the child version of the woman is played by Michelle, and I have to look up her name again, but she would go on to have this great career playing Marilyn Monroe, playing in many great films. She's a wonderful actress. She's still around and not that old. But then the third act of this movie goes totally south, and it just becomes a bad ripoff of Alien, where people are going through these tunnels with flamethrowers, and there's this kid in it who looks like shit. The design is terrible, so apparently H.R. Giger said, "I'm out of here." And so it's worth watching for the first 2/3, and then it goes south, and you just kind of say, well, that's a lost opportunity. They made several sequels of Species, I haven't seen them, but this, for everything I've just mentioned, it's well worth seeing, and the design work is just spectacular, and and it's a lost opportunity. If they just kind of followed through, it's a very, anytime you create a science fiction story, there's a branching road, and those of us who know the genre know how that road branches, and one branching direction is to ripping off everything that's worked, so that you come up with something that has no originality and no originality and just crap. The other way is where you go, okay, I'm going to go off where I know the genre, I might reference the genre, but I'm going to come up with something that's my own, something that has its own flavor and its own voice. Now that's risky too, because you may fail, but I'd rather fail coming up with something original than ripping off something where everyone knows what you're ripping off and they just kind of groan. So just an opinion. So then we get Strange Days, which Catherine Bigelow directed. She was married, I think, at that time to James Cameron. James Cameron, I may have written this movie, I don't recall. But Ralph Fiennes is in it. He's very good in it. Angela Bassett is great in it. Juliette Lewis is great in it. Not an A-list film, but an interesting film. It's about the 1990s switch over to 2000. So it's really commenting in 1995 on a very near future, but it extrapolates. And it's a good film. It's a good film and worth checking out. Then we get Tank Girl, which has Lori Petty. It's kind of a Mad Max kind of film. Has Ice-T, Naomi Watts, Malcolm McDowell. Some people like this film, some people don't. It kind of polarizes people. But if you want to check it out, you might find value in it. Then we get another great film, okay? Now, I mentioned that the action stars coming into the 90s were Schwarzenegger and Stallone, and then you had sort of the B level with guys like Dolph Lundgren and Jean-Claude Van Damme, these muscle guys, and Die Hard came out. And Die Hard was a completely different action hero, a much more human action figure. They cast a guy who was a TV star off of, moonlighting, and the film blew everyone away. It was a huge hit, and it made Bruce Willis a movie star. So Terry Gilliam, who'd been a designer, a cartoonist, and animator with Monty Python, had started directing his own films like Time Bandits, things like that. And he did Brazil, which was a very problematical production, but he had a really great visual sense, and he came up with this really, really, really weird film, and it's called 12 Monkeys, and it's a time travel film. And basically it stars Bruce Willis and a young actor just making a name for himself, Brad Pitt, and Madeline Stowe, who was a big movie star at that point too. And it's beautifully designed. It's a very strange film, but a very interesting film. Bruce Willis plays a time traveler coming back from a dystopic future to try to avert the disaster that basically, wrecked mankind. And in a way, Terry Gilliam's vision is so hard-edged, it really goes against the action figure that Bruce Willis could have played. The guy's a little too much of a loose cannon kind of guy, but that was the director's vision. And it's a really good film. It's a really interesting film. It's a little off-putting, but the visual design is terrific. The plot is very, very interesting. And Brad Pitt is absolutely terrific in it. Absolutely terrific. And everyone else is really, really, really strong. It was spun off as a TV series many years later. And actually on Sliders, I got to use in Slide Cage, the episode that used the props from Time Cop, the sets from Time Cop, we actually used a spacesuit, an environment suit from this film as well. But if you haven't seen 12 Monkeys, definitely check it out. It's a good one. It's a good one. So then off of that, we get Village of the Damned, which is John Carpenter making an adaptation of John Wyndham's book, The Midwich Cuckoos. It's a great, great, great book about a very odd alien invasion. It was made into a very good film in the 60s, a black and white film that I really like. I think I like the black and white one much more than John Carpenter's version, but this one stars Christopher Reeve before he was paralyzed, and Kirstie Alley, who played Savick in Wrath of Khan. Again, check it out. It's not a disaster. Then we have Virtuosity, which stars Denzel Washington, who was an up-and-coming movie star at the time, and it has a villain who would become a movie star in later days, Russell Crowe, and he plays a villain in this. It's kind of got about video games and stuff intruding on the real world. Denzel Washington plays a cop, it's a good film, good, solid, entertaining film. This is Russell Crowe before he would make Gladiator 5 years later, and that would, of course, punch through in every way. Now there were also, every studio during this period was making science fiction films. Star Wars had proved that you could blow, you could make tons of money with science fiction. So now you had all of these studios making science fiction. Sometimes there would be a huge misfire, a film that just went way off the rails. Now Kevin Costner was a huge A-list movie star at this point. He had made Field of Dreams. He had made Dances with Wolves, just exemplary stuff. But then he decided to make Waterworld. Waterworld is a big dystopic science fiction movie where the polar caps, sorry about the dogs, the polar caps they're going for a walk. The polar caps have melted and there's no land anymore, which would not be what happens, by the way. If the polar caps melted, you would still have land. But it's a goofy, strange movie. And this is the deluxe edition that includes the TV version, which is significantly longer. And it's just a weird movie. Dennis Hopper's the villain. Jean Tripplehorn is the romantic lead, and Costner plays this kind of Gilman kind of guy, and he's kind of an asshole through most of it. And it has practical effects. Some of the practical effects are phenomenal. The fight scenes and things like that. It's a film that is very much in the Mad Max mold, and in fact, some of the staging of how Dennis Hopper talks on this big balcony to his people down on this huge freighter ship, you see a riff of that in Mad Max Fury Road years later with Immortan Joe, and this is probably an influence on that. It's a very interesting film. It's not a good film necessarily. There's a lot of missteps and a lot of mistakes, but also it's very inventive. And Costner directed it, I believe. Let me see if I'm right about that. Yes, he did. No, Kevin Reynolds, his buddy Kevin Reynolds directed it, and they had a big falling out on this movie. And but this is when Kevin Costner's career started to go south a bit. He's kind of back now, which is good. Very talented actor, but this film is not his great moment by any means. But if you haven't seen it, it's well worth checking out. Then we get it. So that's the end essentially of the 1995 films. I mean, we could talk about White Dwarf, but I think most people would rather talk about Red Dwarf. But that's when we get to TV. So this is 1995. We'll resume shortly with the rest of the 90s. Lots of great films coming, and lots of interesting films, and lots of really bad films. But we'll get to all of that stuff. So that's it for now. Definitely check out other videos on Mr. Sci-Fi. Subscribe, hit the little notifications thing so you get alerted, because we post videos at least once a week and more if we can, if we choose to. If there's something you'd like me to talk about on Mr. Sci-Fi, please let me know. I'm happy to do it. And boy, are we busy now with the props, with sets, costumes, rolling camera, moving big set pieces around, writing, directing, producing, you name it. I've also been doing a lot of interviews because I'm going to be launching a new thing where I do all the remaining Twilight Zone commentaries, all 100 episodes I haven't yet done. And so if you can check me out on Film Courage and Egotastic Fun Time and many other podcasts around the dial. So you can also just check that out, and you'll see a lot of me talking in a variety of clothes. And that's about it. So stay healthy, stay safe, enjoy your life, and tell the people you love that you love them. That's it for now, guys. Bye.